While researching my Larry Crawford video, I came across some information that I hadn't noticed before that caused me to re-examine a conclusion I presented in my big old Ralph Yates video. That conclusion was that Ralph Yates met with Jack Ruby at the B&B Cafe in the wee hours of November 22nd, 1963. And in order to explain this, I'm going to run through the reasons that I first came to that conclusion. And I still hold that conclusion now, even though I found some information that challenged it. And I want to see if I can go through all of that in a 15-minute video. Ralph Yates talked to the FBI, and he said that he gave a man a ride from Oak Cliff to the Texas School Book Depository on November 20th, 1963, and that he thought that had been Lee Harvey Oswald. And he said he dropped them off at the Texas School Book Depository. He doesn't say he saw him go in, but he dropped him off there. And this person talked about how someone could shoot the president from a building, he said. And anyway, and also in this first statement, it gives a description of Ralph Yates. And part of that description is a 2-inch burn scar running from left corner of mouth upward on left cheek. And in a subsequent statement, although he went back and forth on this, Ralph Yates said that the man, Oswald, in the car, in his truck that he was giving a ride to, mentioned the Carousel Club and Jack Ruby. And also, according to an FBI report, that Ralph Yates had a relative. They don't say exactly what his relationship is, but he had a relative that did printing work for Jack Ruby. So we have, and other information shows that this relative was Jack Ruby's current printer. So Ralph Yates has a relative who knows Jack Ruby. Ralph Yates says his ride, who he thought was Oswald, mentioned Jack Ruby. And Ralph Yates has a 2-inch scar on his left cheek. And Mary Lawrence worked at the B&B restaurant, and she said on Friday, in this FBI interview, I don't know if it's the first interview, but it's the first one I have. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at approximately 1:30 a.m., a young man described as white, in his 20s, 5'7", 5'9", medium build, 140 pounds, dark hair, came into the restaurant and sat down at a table, and when approached stated he was waiting for Mr. Ruby, who would be in a few minutes. About 2:15 or 2:30 a.m., November 22nd, 1963, Jack Ruby came into the B&B restaurant. After looking at the young man at the table, sat down at a table behind the cash register. He didn't sit down with the young man. He did not order his usual food, stating that he did not feel good, and ordered a large glass of orange juice. A few minutes later, the young man who was seated at the table went over to Ruby's table. Thereafter, Ruby paid the bill for both himself and the young man who had eaten. Mrs. Lawrence had never seen this young man in the restaurant before, nor had she ever seen him with Jack Ruby prior to this occasion. On November 22nd, 1963, after the assassination of President Kennedy and after the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald, Mrs. Lawrence saw Oswald on television and stated the photograph of Oswald on television appeared very similar to the young man who was with Jack Ruby in the B&B restaurant earlier on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. Subsequently, Mrs. Lawrence and Bobby, the cashier on the night shift at the B&B restaurant, discussed the young man who was with Ruby in the early morning of November 22nd, and they agreed that he appeared very similar to Lee Harvey Oswald. Mrs. Lawrence was shown a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald, and she stated the young man who was with Jack Ruby in the B&B restaurant on the early morning of November 22nd, 1963, was similar in description and appearance to Lee Harvey Oswald. She recalled, however, that the young man she had seen in the B&B restaurant had a small scar near his mouth, either on the right side or the left side. So in the FBI report, she mentions a scar near the mouth, but doesn't, according to the FBI, doesn't remember which side of the mouth it was on. She gives a more definitive statement to the Dallas police in January. And there she says, at this point in the interview, the subject stated that she could not be sure that this man was Oswald, but if he had a small, deep scar on his left cheek, it was him. So we don't get this, we get a more definitive statement of where this scar is. It's a small, deep scar on his left cheek. And according to the FBI report, Ralph Yates has a 2-inch burn scar running from left corner of mouth upward on left cheek. So I concluded that this was good enough to say that's Ralph Yates because of the circumstances. Of course, Mary Lawrence was not shown a photograph of Ralph Yates. Now, this has been explained away by Bugliosi, and in this FBI document here, it says, in connection with the information furnished by Mary Lawrence, it should be noted that Curtis Laverne Crafard, Larry Crawford, when interviewed, advised that he was the individual who was with Jack Ruby at the B&B Cafe at approximately 3:45 a.m. on November 21st, 1963. And Crafard pointed out that when he met Ruby at the B&B Cafe, Ruby was accompanied by a girl named Gloria. Now, this does not correspond to what Mary Lawrence said. It's the wrong day. It's the day before. Ruby has a woman with him, and she didn't say anything about Ruby coming in with a woman. The clear sense is that Ruby came in alone. And it's also a little later than what she said. So I concluded that even though the official story has this explanation, that it's Larry Crawford and not Ralph Yates, that nonetheless the official story is wrong, and I'm right, that it was Ralph Yates who met with Ruby on that morning at the B&B Cafe, and I think the scar is very strong evidence. The fact that Yates said that Oswald mentioned Ruby to him, and the fact that Yates has a relative who works for Ruby, I think you put all that together, especially the scar, that it's Ralph Yates who met with Ruby. And I also went on to explain why I thought that was significant in the story, which I'm not going to get into here. So I was comfortable with that conclusion until in my Crafard research I came upon his November 29th statement. And on page 4 of that statement, he relates the story about eating at the B&B Cafe with Ruby, but it's all because he was going to manage the Vegas club on that night. And he mentions that he did that in a way that corresponds to what that FBI document said that I showed. But it also mentions that he went there the next night, too. That is, on the right night. On November 21st, 1963, Ruby called the club to wake him up at about 11 a.m. and then came in later in the afternoon, sometime between 12 and 3. Andy was at the club at this time, and he recalled there was a woman along with her husband who desired a job. Thereafter, Ruby left, and later in the afternoon called him again to go to the Vegas as the bartender. At about 7:30 p.m., Ruby picked him up and took him to the Vegas club, and he did not see Ruby again until approximately 2:30 a.m. after closing, at which time they again had breakfast at the Lucas B&B, returning to the Carousel at about 3:30 or 4 a.m. Now, a reasonable person, and I don't claim to be that, but a reasonable person reading this would say, well, Ruby and Crafard were there on the same day, the same early morning hours that Mary Lawrence thought she saw Oswald, and I think it was Ralph Yates. So a reasonable person would say, well, you're mistaken. It really was Crafard. So what are you talking about? Here's the evidence. Okay, reasonable person, I understand. And another thing the reasonable person might point out if he knows that I was not aware of when I made my Ralph Yates video is that the Vegas Club is very close to the B&B restaurant, and neither one is very close to the Carousel Club. So the way Mary Lawrence tells the story is that the young man came in first, and then Ruby came in later. It could very well be, though it's not stated in this Crafard document, that Crafard closed up the Vegas Club himself and then went to the B&B restaurant. He might have walked to it, it's very close, and he might have started eating there before Ruby got there. So it would even explain the sequence of events presented by Mary Lawrence in that event. So I almost changed my mind when I read that, when I realized that, how close the B&B Cafe was to the Vegas Club. But I still think I'm right, and now I have to say why. And still, the strongest evidence is the scar. According to the FBI, Ralph Yates has a burned scar running from left corner of mouth upward on left cheek. And according to Mary Lawrence, the person she saw had a small, deep scar on his left cheek. Given this and the other circumstances I mentioned, I think it has to be Ralph Yates unless Crafard has such a scar. Unfortunately, for my theory, the FBI made a description in that same November 29th document. They put down a description of Larry Crawford, and they noted his scars. And he has a 1-inch scar on the calf of his right leg. They noticed a scar on the calf of his right leg. And a 1/2-inch scar, center of upper lip. That's the same scar Oswald has, by the way. You get it apparently from being punched in the mouth and having a tooth come through your lip. That's what happened to Oswald, though he didn't lose the tooth. And it happened to Crafard just when he was working at the state fair. Somebody knocked 4 of his front teeth out. That's probably where he got his scar, too. But there's the FBI sitting with Crafard face to face, writing down his scars, and they don't mention anything about a scar on his right cheek or his left cheek. But Mary Lawrence, who's just a waitress at the B&B Cafe, saw a scar on this man's left cheek. So I don't think Mary Lawrence could have seen a scar that the FBI didn't notice when they were taking down a description and listing scars. It cannot be Crafard. And if it's not Crafard, then it's got to be Yates. Also, I'll note here that Mary Lawrence said that she had never seen this young man in the restaurant before, nor had she ever seen him with Jack Ruby prior to this occasion. And yet we have, from the Crafard FBI interview, the fact, according to the FBI, that Crafard said he was in there the night before with Ruby. So now we don't know for certain that Mary Lawrence worked both nights, but usually somebody who's on a night shift works the nights. We don't know for sure, but if she had been working the previous night, then she would have seen Larry Crawford before. And she may even have seen Larry Crawford before anyway, because Larry went places with Ruby, and Ruby ate at the B&B Cafe on many occasions. But if the Crawford story was true, then that would mean that he had been in there the night before, and I would think probably that Mary Lawrence would have been working the night before and would have seen him. So I'm still of the opinion that this Oswald sighting was really a sighting of Ralph Yates. I think the scar evidence clinches it, and I think probably the FBI information is a fabrication by somebody, either by Crafard or by the FBI, because I don't think the FBI could possibly miss a scar on Larry Crawford's cheek. So I still say it's Yates.